The blade was already at Bohlah's throat when Tahyo walked in. "He touched what belongs to the palace," the guard growled. "He deserves death." Bohlah hadn't touched anything. He had only looked. Looked at the prince the way no servant was ever supposed to look, with hunger, with reverence, with something dangerously close to love. Tahyo crossed the room in 3 massive strides, his enormous frame filling the doorway like a god carved from dark stone. He wrapped one enormous hand around the guard's wrist and squeezed, slowly, until the blade dropped. "He belongs to me," Tahyo said quietly, "and I decide what he deserves." Their eyes met over the fallen blade. Neither of them breathed. That was the moment everything became impossible to undo.
If you're coming across this channel for the very first time, please do well to subscribe, like, and share. This is Love Tales with Cynthia.
Prince Tahyo of the Adureh kingdom had never once loved his body. At 32, he stood taller than any man in the palace, broader than the palace doors when he turned sideways, and heavier than 2 of his younger brothers combined. His people called him Odiu, the mountain. They meant it with pride. He received it like a wound. He had spent his entire life watching men flinch when he entered a room. Watching women, he courted master discomfort with polite smiles. His father, the aging King Moru, called his size a blessing from the ancestors. Tahyo called it prison. He requested new servants every few months. Not out of cruelty, out of shame. He could not bear to watch another pair of eyes travel the full length of him and settle into quiet pity. Bohlah arrived on a Tuesday, recommended by the head housekeeper as efficient and unafraid. He was 28, lean and dark as river water at night. He walked into Tahyo's chamber, looked directly up at the prince without blinking, and said simply, "You are the largest man I have ever seen." Tahyo braced himself for the rest of it. It never came. Bohlah just nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and began making the bed. Within 1 week, Tahyo noticed things about Bohlah that he had never noticed about any servant before. Bohlah's hands never trembled when he helped the prince dress. Most servants fumbled with the large ceremonial clasps, muttering apologies, their fingers shaking under Tahyo's unintentional, intimidating gaze. Bohlah worked with calm precision, his warm fingers grazing Tahyo's collarbone as he fastened the gold neck piece, entirely unbothered. "You are not afraid of me," Tahyo said one morning. It was not a question. "Should I be?" Bohlah replied, eyes still focused on the clasp. "The last servant I had prayed loudly every time I raised my arm too quickly." Bohlah laughed, a quiet, private laugh, as though he were keeping it just between his own ribs. "People fear what they have made small in their minds. I have not made you small." Tahyo went very still. No one had ever said anything remotely like that to him. He wanted to ask what Bohlah had made him instead, but pride sealed his mouth shut. That evening, when Tahyo accidentally knocked over his carved wooden desk, the heavy one, the one 6 men had carried in, Bohlah simply stepped around it and began picking up the scattered papers without comment. No gasp, no jump, no wide, frightened eyes. Just quiet, steady hands. Tahyo sat on the edge of his bed and watched him, something unfamiliar pulling behind his sternum. He told himself it was gratitude. He was already lying to himself by day 3. Tahyo broke his mirror on a Thursday. Not violently. He turned too quickly in the narrow corridor beside his wardrobe, and his shoulder sent it crashing. It shattered into 4 heavy pieces. He stood looking down at the broken reflection, his face fractured, his massive shoulders split into fragments, and felt irrationally that it was the most honest portrait of him he had ever seen. Bohlah appeared in the doorway with a cloth and a small broom. "Leave it," Tahyo said. "It will cut your feet in the night." I said, "Leave it." Bohlah set the broom against the wall and left, but he came back an hour later, after Tahyo had gone to the outer chamber, and quietly cleaned up every shard. When Tahyo returned and found it gone, he stood in the empty space where the mirror had been for a long time. The next morning he said nothing about it, but when Bohlah brought his morning tea, Tahyo looked at him, really looked, and said, "Why you keep returning to things I tell you to abandon?" Bohlah set the cup down gently. "Because sometimes what you say and what you need are different things, Your Highness." The title sat strangely in his mouth, almost tender. Tahyo looked away first. The palace bathhouse was private, reserved for the prince's hour at dusk. Bohlah stood at the entrance with warm towels, as was expected of him, eyes properly directed at the floor. Tahyo walked past him, shed his robe, and lowered his massive body into a stone basin with the exhaustion of a man carrying years, not just weight. The silence stretched. Then Tahyo said, without planning to, "Do you think I am ugly?" Bohlah's jaw tightened. "That is not a servant's question to answer. I am not asking my servant. I am asking you." "A beat, too." "No," Bohlah said, voice low. "I do not think that." "What do you think?" Bohlah finally looked up. The evening light fell across the prince, the dark planes of his enormous chest, the breadth of his shoulders rising from the water, and something in Bohlah's expression shifted into territory that was deeply unservant-like. "I think you are the kind of man the old songs were written about," he said quietly. "The kind that makes the earth feel small." Tahyo's throat moved. "You should not say things like that. You should not ask questions like that." Neither of them moved. The water went cold before Tahyo finally looked away. The rains came heavy that night, and a leak in the roof drove water into Tahyo's outer chamber. Bohlah stayed late, placing clay pots and rearranging furniture, and when it was done, the storm had sealed the lower palace corridor shut with flooding. "You will stay in the antechamber," Tahyo said. It was practical. It was nothing, but the antechamber shared a thin wall with the prince's room, and in the deep quiet of the storm, Tahyo could hear Bohlah breathing. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of every sound, the shift of a body on a mat, a quiet exhale, silence so full it had texture. He did not sleep. At some point past midnight, Bohlah's voice came soft to the wall. "Are you awake, Your Highness?" "Yes." "Are you all right?" "Why would I not be?" A pause. "You get very quiet when you are not." Tahyo closed his eyes. The accuracy of that observation did something frightening to his chest. "Go to sleep, Bohlah." "Yes, Your Highness." But neither of them slept for a long time, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and that shared quiet secret was more intimate than anything Tahyo had allowed in years. It began over nothing. A ceremonial robe Bohlah had sent to be restitched without asking. "You do not make decisions about my things," Tahyo said, his voice low and controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. "The seam was splitting. You had been humiliated in front of the council. That is not your concern. Everything about you is my concern." Bohlah snapped, then stopped, caught himself. The words hung in the garden air between banana leaves and red flowering vines. Tahyo stared at him. Bohlah straightened, composed himself, and said quietly, "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "Say it again," Tahyo said. "Your Highness." "What you just said. Say it again." Bohlah met his eyes. Something raw was sitting just beneath the surface of both of them, barely contained. "I cannot," Bohlah said. "If I say it again, I will not be able to stop at just those words." The silence that followed was the loudest thing the garden had ever held. Tahyo turned and walked back inside. But at the door he stopped, one massive hand on the frame, and did not turn around when he said, "The robe looked better for it. Thank you." Then he was gone. Bohlah stood alone in the garden and pressed his hand flat against his own chest, trying to hold something in place. It was Tahyo who moved first, and it surprised both of them. Bohlah had been showing him a letter, something routine, something administrative, and in leaning over to point at the signature, his shoulder had pressed against Tahyo's arm. Just that, just a shoulder. Tahyo caught his hand, not aggressively, not with the authority of a prince, with the quiet, desperate grip of a man who had been standing at the edge of something enormous for weeks, and had simply run out of strength to step back. Bohlah went very still. "Your Highness," he said carefully. "Don't," Tahyo said. Just that word. Bohlah turned to look at him fully. The prince's face was open in a way Bohlah had never seen. No armor, no careful royal blankness. Just a man, 32 years old and achingly tired being alone, inside his own overwhelming body. "This is not something I can walk back from," Bohlah said softly. "I know. And you? Do you know what you're asking? I have known for weeks." Tahyo's thumb moved slowly across Bohlah's knuckles. "I had just been afraid." Bohlah looked down at their hands. His lean fingers swallowed gently inside the prince's massive palm, and felt something unlock in him that had been sealed shut for longer than he could name. "So have I," he admitted. Tahyo had never let anyone hold him, not since childhood, not since he grew large enough that the idea became absurd. Who held mountains? Mountains held everything else. But that night, after everything that passed between them, Bohlah simply placed his hand flat on the center of Tahyo's chest, over her heart, and kept it there. Tahyo stopped breathing for a moment. "Does this bother you?" Bohlah asked. "No," Tahyo said, and it came out rougher than he intended. "You are trembling." "I am aware." Bohlah said nothing more. He simply kept his hand there, feeling the enormous heartbeat under his palm, steady and fast and very human. And slowly, Tahyo's shoulders dropped from where they had been locked up near his ears for what felt like his entire adult life. "I have hated this body," Tahyo said to the ceiling. "Every year of it." "I know," Bohlah said. "You do not hate it." "I have never hated it. Not for one moment." Tahyo turned his head and looked at him. "Why?" Bohlah held his gaze. "Because it is yours. And everything that is yours has become, without my permission, something I find it impossible to look away from." The prince exhaled like a man setting down a load he had carried across a continent. He covered Bohlah's hand with his own. Word reached the king by morning. It always did. Tahyo was summoned before sunrise. He dressed in silence, Bohlah helping her with the ceremonial clasps. The same ones, the same hands. But everything different now, weighted with what they had both chosen. "Do not kneel," Tahyo said quietly. "Whatever happens, do not kneel for anyone's cruelty." Bohlah looked up at him. "And you? Will you kneel?" Tahyo fastened the last clasp himself. "I spent 32 years kneeling inside my own skin. I am finished." King Mor was old but not soft. He sat on his carved throne and looked at his largest son for a long time without speaking. "Then is it true?" "Yes," Tahyo said. "He is a servant. He is the only man who has ever stood next to me without flinching." Another long silence. The king's face was unreadable. He looked at Tahyo, really looked, the way fathers sometimes forget to, and saw something there he perhaps had not seen before. Not shame, not apology. A man standing fully upright in his own body for what might have been the very first time. King Mor closed his eyes briefly. "You will handle this with dignity," he said finally. "You will handle it as a prince." It was not approval, but it was not destruction either. Tahyo bowed once and walked out. A month later, Bohlah stood in the palace garden at dusk. No longer as a servant, his position a complicated new thing that the court was still learning the words for. Tahyo came and stood beside him. They watched the sun turn the sky the deep orange red of Kola, nut over the wide flat rooftops of Adureh. "They are still talking," Bohlah said. "They will always be talking. Does it trouble you?" Tahyo was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted Bohlah's hand and held it openly in the garden where anyone might pass and see, and said, "You know what troubled me? 32 years of apologizing for the space I took up. 32 years of making myself feel small to make others comfortable." He looked down at their joined hands. "You ended that, without even trying." Bohlah looked up at him. This mountain of a man, this prince who had spent a lifetime at war with his own reflection, and felt something so full and warm it pressed against the inside of his ribs. "You were never too much," Bohlah said. "You were always just exactly enough." Tahyo pulled him close. And for the first time in his life, the largest man in the kingdom of Adureh took up his full space in the world, and did not apologize for any of it.
Tahyo and Bohlah's story is a reminder that the parts of ourselves we have been taught to shrink are often the very parts someone else is quietly in awe of. Size, presence, the space you occupy. None of it is a burden. It only feels that way until the right person stands next to you and refuses to look away. Love, when it is real, does not ask you to be less. It pulls you into the fullness of who you already are. If this story moved you, held you, or made you feel seen in any way, please subscribe, like, and share. See you on the next story. Bye for now.